Welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership podcast. I'm Melissa Hamilton. I'm a former global CEO, company director, and these days I spend my time thinking deeply about influence and leadership and what actually moves people. I've led organisations with more than 5,000 people globally, and over the last few years I've interviewed over 250 leaders, leading CEOs, company chairs and academics. And one thing became clear: the strategic imperative of people leadership has never been more critical, and that's why today I'm in conversation with Chief People Officers. The CPO function has fundamentally shifted. It's no longer a support function, it's strategic. And these leaders sit at the centre of leadership, culture, and long term performance with a unique view of how executives are shaped over time. So today I'm curious about Damian Zahra's journey, about the moments that shaped how he leads and what he's navigating right now as he helps build an organisation fit for what's coming next. Damian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Melissa. It's so wonderful to be here. Thanks for the invitation to come and have a conversation about something that we're equally both passionate about. So thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Let me share your bio for people who haven't come across you before. So, Damian Zahra is the Chief People Officer at Bunnings Group, leading the people and safety function and overseeing the delivery of the organisation's people and safety strategy. He brings more than 20 years' experience in senior human resources roles across property, online media, professional services, and retail sectors. Prior to joining Bunnings, Damian was General Manager People and Culture at Vicinity Centres and previously held senior leadership roles at the REA Group, where he led the International People and Culture Program. And Damian's also a board member of the Corporate Mental Health Alliance in Australia. So, Damian, in your own words, who are you as a human being? And take me back to how you found your way into this role. And perhaps along the way, what are some parts of the journey that make sense that didn't make sense at the time?
What a big question to start with. So, who am I as a human being? I'd like to think that you'd get, a similar answer from, my loved ones and my family and friends, and they'd say something very similar. But I guess I'm someone who is, I enjoy the fairly simple things in life. I'm a very family-oriented person, and, really enjoy and value, friendships and relationships. And I feel like a lot of the times I live, in service of helping others. I mean, that's something that's been deeply embedded in me from a very young age. Um, and I'm also someone who, is very curious about lots of different things. And I think that's largely led me to why I am in the role I am today, and why I've been, perhaps, been fortunate enough to be given some opportunities, sort of at a very, very early on age. So today I have the very fortunate position. I think I have the best job, in Australia and New Zealand, being the Chief People Officer of Bunnings. I've been with the business for a little under 7 years, which has gone very quickly. And I guess I find myself in this role today, largely because, one day out of the blue, I received a phone call that Bunnings were looking for, someone to come in and lead the people function. And it was, had the opportunity to work with my predecessor, Jackie Coombs. And I think first and foremost, when I learnt of where the role was at, being at Bunnings, I was incredibly interested because I was a customer first. Melissa, I'm guilty of spending a lot of my weekends in stores with my children.
So am I. So am I.
Wondering, so are you. Good, fantastic. Wandering the aisles. And I just really, really enjoyed my time at Bunnings. And so when the opportunity was presented to, come in and have a conversation about, the CPRO Bunnings, I was just so delighted. I got to meet a lot of the executive team at the time and did my own research as well. Had the privilege of meeting Mike Schneider as well. And Mike, who's been my boss for a number of years now, is someone who is, he's unbelievably authentic and humanistic and compassionate, and arguably one of the the best retailers globally. I couldn't pass up an opportunity to come and work for someone like Mike, and at the time Jackie Coombs, for a business like Bunnings. And I kind of pinch myself at times that I'm in the role I'm in today.
How did you get there? What were some of the sort of fundamental roles you had along the way that shaped you and I guess gave you what you needed and the reputation and all of those things to be able to step into the role?
Look, I started work at a very early on age, working in family businesses. So I've always had an interest in, if you like, business and commerce. But I've also had a really strong passion for high performance sporting teams, and played sport, in my sort of my earlier years. And I was always fascinated by how do you marry the two together.
Mm.
So there are certain elements within high performing sporting environments that could easily translate to business environments, and if you could bring those two together, what could it look like? So I was, being sort of a curious person, made myself a bit of a nuisance at the time when I was working in retail, just casually, for the Coles My Biz at the time. Agreed to volunteer and work with the HR team there, and was fortunate enough to land a job working for the Coles My Biz at the time, and then sort of traversed different industries. So spent a good 7.5 to 8 years working within the professional services sector for a
Mm.
commercial law firm called Russell Kennedy. I was fortunate enough to be, I guess, given a HR manager role at a very young age. So I think from memory at the time, I might have been 26 or 27, leading a firm of a couple of hundred people, which again, I was pinching myself at that opportunity, but it gave me an opportunity to learn very quickly and to adapt, and in a way, helped shape who I am today. So whilst my career has sort of traversed not just professional services, but I spent time working for REA Group, the digital media business, Vicinity Centres, the property business, and now back into retail at Bunnings. I've always spent time understanding business problems first,
Hmm.
and then really find a way to help apply people and culture solutions to that. I
Mm.
think there's lots of different examples where strategy has been clearly articulated, but doesn't necessarily translate to the commercial outcomes or the business outcomes you're after. And I've been interested and curious to be able to help businesses solve that problem.
I love how you use, and I've heard you use it quite a few times today, and it's a lovely, humble, and I'm sure reflective of you as a person. But there's a lot of reflection there around I was very fortunate to be given this role at a young age. And I think you and I both know, as you reflect back on that, there's some luck involved, but there's also a whole lot of talent, right? So if you could be objective about yourself for a
Mm.
minute, what do you think people saw that got you into those opportunities?
Yeah, look, I think I was someone who was, clearly very curious, someone who was very reliable,
Hmm.
someone who was, I, I guess, a person who, I value my word. And so if I give you my word, then, that means a lot to me.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna let you down. And I think those traits, and it's funny enough, I mean, I look for those sorts of traits in the people I work with today as well. To me, it, suggests, not just humility, but commitment and dedication and discipline and hard work, and someone who's sort of achievement oriented.
Yeah.
So that was some of the traits I think early on that and I have terrific relationships with a lot of the bosses that I've worked for in the past, and there's some of the things that they've said about me.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm also very empathetic as well. I've always been empathetic to not just business situations but individual circumstances. And they're probably traits that I had at a very early on age that I still value enormously today.
Yeah.
That perhaps led me to the opportunities that I was given.
Well, in some ways, and this was a conversation you and I started before we came on camera this morning. I mean, it was the very first thing you said to me, which was, we're sitting at the brink of a fuel crisis of sorts. And I think the first thing on your mind was, how are people dealing with that?
Yeah, we're talking at an interesting time. There's the geopolitical environment is, there's clearly a lot of tension, and I carry an enormous amount of responsibility today. So today, Bunnings employs, just under 60,000 team members across Australia and New Zealand, and so it is incumbent upon me in my role to ensure that our team have clarity, that we're very clear on the direction we're going in, but we also have meaningful employment opportunities for everyone. And so, with that comes enormous amount of responsibility. And so, together with, all the leaders in the business today, we're working towards providing as much clarity as possible at a time when there's so much ambiguity, Melissa.
Yeah.
We're dealing with lots of unpredictability, lots of ambiguity, and trying to provide certainty in that environment. It's no doubt it's a challenge, and I think the message that I've learned, and the lessons I've learned through this is you're not always going to have the answers,
No.
and that's okay. Sometimes you just need to call it for what it is, but acknowledge that you don't have the answers, but you are searching for them. And I think that just gives people calmness and clarity of, that we're on the right track. And when you do, have access to the right level of information, you're able to share that as quickly as possible, so your teams can make the best decisions that they can for them.
Yeah. What do you think is the most misunderstood thing potentially about the people function?
I think, and it's probably been a bit of a long-held view, is it's a support function. I mean, it's a very traditionalist way of thinking about it, I think, because it's so much more than just, a support function within itself. I think in a lot of ways, the chief people officer today needs to be an interpreter of strategy. You need to be able to understand what are the business challenges you are dealing with and you're facing. How do you anticipate challenges that are emerging? And then how do you help position that organization for growth? What are the levers that you can pull around organizational culture and capabilities? And how do you help ensure that the strategy is delivered upon? So I think in a lot of ways, the role that we play today, you're probably sitting at the intersection of, organizational strategy, you're sitting at the intersection of organizational capability, but also managing risk, and then managing, the execution of the plan as well. So I think in a lot of ways, it's far more strategic than it ever has been before. And I'd like to think and hope that in a lot of organisations today that, the CPO role and the function itself are largely seen as strategic enablers as well, not just the support function. I hope we've sort of moved well beyond what used to be called, Melissa, the personnel function back in the day, right?
Yes.
We're so much more advanced, I think, than, that sort of language.
This is interesting, right? Because the question I was going to ask you was, at what point did you realise that the role could shape outcomes and not support them? And I think from our first conversation together, I think you always went in with the perspective that you could shape outcomes. But is there a moment that stands out for you where perhaps it really became clear?
Look, I think there are most organisations, be it not for profit or for profit, have the best laid plans and the best laid strategies and plans to deliver on, be it growth or whatever it might be, perhaps that the businesses are striving for. But I think history is littered with lots of different examples where the strategy is not delivered upon and it fails. And if you trace back why wasn't the organisation able to deliver on what it was proposing to deliver on, a lot of it comes down to your organisational culture, and also the capabilities or lack of capabilities you might have within sort of that context. So I think in a lot of ways, the strategic HR leader today needs to be able to interpret the strategic agenda and then help ensure that you have the right tools and culture to deliver on that. So I think that's sort of how, I have a really strong preference and bias to, be strategy first, understand it intimately, and then think about how we apply sort of the skills that we have. It's so much more than just rolling out programs or rolling out the usual cyclical processes that you might expect, because I think the reality, particularly with the prevalence of artificial intelligence in the workforce today, requires a very different way of businesses thinking about the people and culture or the safety agenda as well.
You shared a story with me, and I can't remember which organisation it was, whether it was Vicinity or REA, where you were given almost like an unusual project at the time, potentially for a CPO to lead. Can you remind me what that was?
I'm just trying to
You've got
think
to
about
remind
that.
yourself first what it
Yeah.
was.
Look, I think one of the more fascinating projects that I've had the privilege of leading was, Vicinity is an interesting organisation at the time. The Vicinity Centres was born out of the merger of two businesses, Novion Property Group, which came out of Colonial First Aid, and the Centro Property Group, which had its own financial challenges. And I think the Centro Property case study is used in different business schools today as well. So those businesses merged together to form Vicinity Centres at the time. And I wasn't there at the point of merger, but I
Yes.
was there shortly after merger. And one of the reasons I was so sort of enamored by that role particularly was because this was a cultural integration program. And there are lots of different examples where organizational culture has prevented mergers and acquisitions from actually realizing their full value. Sort of the numbers stack up on the spreadsheet, but if culturally you're so disparate, it's very
Yes.
difficult to deliver on the plan. And so that was an interesting, project to work on, because we were bringing together two very different businesses where we had to be very clear about respecting the past, but then be very clear and unapologetic about needing to build for the future. And it all for me starts with your organizational purpose, being very clear on what you're building for. But what we did in that business, which I think was very unique, is we led an agile transformation and a way of working that ultimately democratized access to information to a lot of people. The agile transformation started in the HR team at the time, and with the likes of Simone Carroll and Danielle Wilson, who I'd also worked with previously at REA Group. We've done a lot of work to be able to go, well, what are the core agile principles that we think will work within a business like vicinity centres, and how do we help amplify those principles to engage the hearts and minds of our team? So regardless of whether you'd come from either vicinity or Novion or from somewhere else, you can have access to the right information so you can make the best decisions for you. And cut a long story short, Vicinity is a tremendously successful business. The merger landed. They have high levels of engagement, and I think more importantly, the teams there had a real strong sense of belonging. And I think if you can achieve that strong sense of belonging, then ultimately you stand a good chance of delivering on the success you need.
Tell me about the relationships you need to succeed as a CPI.
Look, I think clearly there has to be high levels of trust. I think because when you have high levels of trust, you can do two things very well. You are expected to support, and I think supporting the business, supporting your colleagues, supporting your peers, and your teams is going to be very important. But Melissa, I think you equally need to be able to challenge,
Yeah.
and providing the context of challenge is coming from a good place. Your intent is good. You're very clear on the business priorities, and your challenge is coming from a place of wanting to be better. And I think if you can strike the balance between equal portions of support and challenge, you create a healthy tension. And with that tension, I think comes growth.
Yeah.
That's where I think most businesses and organizations can grow. And I've seen businesses that have been highly supportive, which is kind of feels good, feels very comfortable, it feels very safe, and it feels nice to work there. But you can ultimately, you can arrive at elements of underperformance.
Yeah.
I've also seen and worked in businesses where it's incredibly challenging, which is okay, but to a certain point you can reach levels of exhaustion. But if you can strike the balance of both, you create a tension where I think you can achieve really good things. I'd also add to that, I think that underpinning the support and challenge component needs to be some very clear decision-making principles. And it's something that my team would probably be sick of me talking about these sorts of things, but I'm very clear about our decision-making processes are about what's best for the company and the team and the individual. And when we all think like that, and what's best for the enterprise, then we get to do a lot, and we get to move at pace, and we have decision-making that is not bogged down in what's best for me.
Yes.
I've also seen some really important, I think, outcomes achieved by that decision-making process. What's best for the company first, then the team, then the individual. Now, clearly, there are times where you need to kind of nuance that a little bit. But if you can get large portions of your core leaders thinking that way, again, I think you stand tremendous chances of delivering on your strategic priorities.
So, how do you keep yourself relevant? And, we spoke before about the incredible complexity of everything going on. How do you keep yourself across so many things? Future work and all of the emerging trends we need to think about.
It's really, look, there's no question. It's really challenging at the moment because we are seeing transformation at scale and pace that we probably haven't seen, well, certainly for a long time. Excuse me. I think I do a few things. I like to. I think I'm well read, and I like to listen to lots of podcasts and listen to thought leaders. I also spend a lot of time networking within my own peer group. I learn a lot. I learn so much from others, and I really do value, forums where I can sit down with, my peers in other businesses, and we can talk about, what's going on in your world, and this is how I'm handling some things, and how are you handling it. It does a few things. It's quite therapeutic because you can
Yeah.
sometimes validate the challenges that you're dealing with. Sometimes it provides moments of inspiration, for you as well. But it also can give you clarity too, which I think then helps you deliver on what you need to do. I think one of the other areas for me that I've really enjoyed is I actually enjoy spending more time outside of my profession as well. So
Yeah.
spending time with tech executives and finance executives and marketing and BD executives, I think helps, if you like, round off the skill sets that I always harbour an aspiration to want to improve on.
Yes.
So I think there's, it's not just one thing that I do. I do multiple things. And I think certainly within, our team and the culture that we've got at Bunnings, we share openly, so if you've read a great article or you've had a conversation or you've been to a forum, you come back and you share that knowledge.
Mm.
And that knowledge sharing, I think, creates a muscle within the business, then it helps us be better as well. I think that's a really important part.
What do you do? I mean, the thing I hear, I mean, you and I both know how important this is, right? But I hear from so many people about, well, how do you find the time to do that?
Yeah, it's truly challenging. And I mean, look, I'm like I said at the opening, Melissa. I mean, I'm a family first person. I've got three young children and a wife, and my family is not the center of my universe. So I always prioritize time with my family, and I never try to miss important school events or milestones and those sorts of things. That's very important to me. I also love my job a lot, and I take my responsibility very seriously. I don't always get the balance right between the two, right?
Mm.
So I'm always sort of trying to be as clear as possible around where I'm spending my time. But the way in which when I look at my diary and I plan my time again, I look at, connecting in with others and reading and those sorts of things is what I consider to be high value, high payoff activities. And
Yes.
so I just prioritize them.
Yeah.
Now it hasn't always been the case because I've gone through periods in my career where I think I've probably under indexed on it.
Mm.
And then I kind of catch myself and I'm like, no, I need to, I need to recalibrate and
Yeah.
spend a bit more time listening and learning and, going back into learning mode, really. I think because I've been curious throughout my career, I've always had a bias towards trying to see what else is going on.
Mm.
But I think truthfully, it's a balancing act. I don't always get it right. But if you come at it with a core principle of curiosity and high value, high payoff, I think you'll always prioritize time for learning. And a lot of learning these days, Melissa, is micro learning too. So it's
Yeah.
short, sharp, just enough, just in time kind of learning.
Where are you at with regards to AI strategy? And what I mean by that is less about what is Bunnings doing, but as Chief People Officer, how central are you to it?
Oh, very close. And this is the real exciting thing about CPO roles, I think, into the future because, well, for a number of reasons. So, first things first, the AI strategy that we have today is in support of the business strategy that we're going after, and that's about creating better customer experiences and team member experiences and those sorts of things. My understanding and the way in which I'm looking at it and we're looking at it is that the AI strategic component, a large portion of it is going to be technologically enabled, which, we all accept. I think a larger proportion, though, is more human centered and human related.
Mm.
So if I think about the way in which, we build organizational capability, or the way in which we think about the rewiring of tasks and how work's completed, how organizations are designed, is largely, fits within the remit of the chief people officer function.
Mm.
So I think it's incumbent upon any CPO to be, absolutely, in partner with, your chief digital officer or your CIO role in helping to build the AI strategy, because a large component of the deployment of it is actually going to fall on, your people leaders. What I'm seeing today is that there are some organizations that are, going down that path. And if I think of even some businesses have gone as far as to, bring both roles together, the CIO and CPO role, which I think is fascinating in a lot of ways. And for a lot of other businesses, they're just ensuring that, both of those executive roles are working very, very closely together and in partnership. I think, we're going to stand our best chance of success if that happens, because, yeah, sort of like I said, the technological component is no doubt a very important part. I think the bigger part, though, is actually going to be the human component and the organizational development component as
Yeah.
well.
Echo exactly what you're saying. And one of the other CPOs in this series has a shared accountability with the CIO top line on the
Yeah, I think that's excellent. Yeah,
yeah.
and I think we'll see more and more businesses, head down this path as well,
Yeah.
which I think is a good thing.
I want to ask you about influence. And when I think of the Chief People Officer role, it doesn't always have, if I use a traditional term of power to achieve outcomes in an organisation, it's a very influential role across peers and across a whole range of people. I'd just love your perspective on that, on influencing people and what you think about when you need to sort of lead change.
Um, I think yeah, when you're leading change, it needs to be underpinned by the why. Like, what is the problem that you are trying to solve? What is is it the team challenge or the organizational challenge or the customer challenge? If the why is clearly understood, how you mobilize the team around you then to deliver on the change initiative, in my experience, is a whole lot easier.
Mhm.
Um, the way in which, though, you go about influencing, it could be very different, because in a lot of change programs, you may come up against organizational resistance. You may come up against individuals who potentially feel a bit uncertain, or a bit unsure about what that path looks like. But I think that's the role of leadership, to go, how do you provide that clarity?
Mm.
Because when you provide that clarity, I think you're able to mobilize the masses more and be able to push through that. That is part of your job as a leader. You do need to push through. So influence is certainly very important, but there are also moments where you just need to kind of press on and move forward with it. And ultimately, if you are a true believer in why you're doing, what you're doing is actually, it's for the betterment of the organization, coming back to company, team, individual, then the way in which you influence the rest of the organization, I think, kind of happens naturally.
Mm.
But it's not a perfect science by any stretch, and it also depends on the maturity and the risk appetite of the business, how change ready they are, and also the culture of the business as well.
Mm. When you think ahead to 2040, which is really not that far away now,
That's
what do you
scary, isn't
think?
it?
Scary, isn't it? I know. What are you thinking? What capability will most clearly separate effective executives from everyone else? What's on your mind?
2040. I think. I think, given the conversation you and I had just even before, we jumped on this, given the geopolitical environment, given the uncertainty, I think there is something about, executives making sense of uncertainty.
Yeah.
How do executives make sense of uncertainty within the constraints of either the organizations that they're working within, the customer demographics they're interacting with, the political landscape, or the geographical landscape they're interacting with as well? I think more and more, and I could be wrong on this, but I think more and more that executives that can make sense of that will stand a better chance, of achieving their ambitions and their goals. Um, and I hope, that ultimately the geopolitical environment starts, we do see, I guess, a settling of that. But if we can help our leaders today build what I think is, learning agility, then we start to build organizational muscle. And the next, I guess, tranche of leaders who can deal with ambiguity, because
Mm.
that's ultimately what we're dealing with today. We're dealing with, not the full set of information. We're dealing with, incomplete sets of data. We're dealing with incomplete sets of, understanding the problem, and we're having to make decisions.
Mm.
Feel more and more that's going to be part of the role of executives and leaders today.
What do you think gets mistaken for leadership potential? And what do you think about when you're choosing the leaders?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Like, leadership potential, I mean, if I think back to some of the more traditional ways of which leadership potential was spoken about, you know, technical expertise, which is a very, very important thing. I don't want to dismiss that. Technical expertise is very important. It shouldn't necessarily be a predictor of leadership potential as such.
Yeah.
Um, Things like being busy is not a great predictor of leadership potential. I think things like being agreeable or well liked are not great predictors of leadership potential either. They're very important factors and very important elements, but they're not, they're not the be all and end all. What I look for when I think about, leadership potential are who are those people in the organization who can deal with ambiguity, who demonstrate a curious mindset, who have the agility and the resilience to work through challenges. Individuals who have, higher levels of emotional intelligence and can read the play, and you can engage the hearts and minds of your team, but you're also prepared to make the tough decisions.
Yeah.
I think there's an interesting blend between that and then sort of the former. So there's some of the things that I think about, from a leadership potential perspective. And I feel like most businesses today have sort of acknowledged that, yes, you need to be technically competent. Yes, you need to be able to deal with sort of high volumes of work. That's all a given now. But there are other super skills that I think we're looking for in leaders of the future.
So I did give you a heads up on this off screen, but your name came up unprompted in a conversation yesterday. So I was speaking to another chief people officer about her sort of career and, do I consider moving to a CEO role? And I think that's increasingly a question that's being put on the table for chief people officers that I don't think traditionally was. Or do you stay on the CPO stream? At which she, and it's time to make you blush maybe, but at which she then said, well, yeah, absolutely. I would like to be like Damian Zahra one day, as your name came out. Now, she gave me more colour on that, Damian, which was she'd seen you speak and she saw clearly that you were a business leader, that your values came through very strongly. And I think also her understanding of how those values, yours and the organisation's, clearly translate to the bottom line. There's a couple of questions in there. How do you think you really translate those values to the bottom line? But secondly, should we see more CPOs moving to CEO roles?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to see more, I'd love to see more CPOs and CROs. And I think, my personal view is that, boards and organizations have woken up to the fact that organizational culture matters. And you need individuals who are sitting around the table who can have very clear perspectives and opinions on, not just how you protect and defend your culture, but also how you evolve it as well. I think that's really, really important. And I think that is a good thing. And I think we will see more and more CPOs who are in, leadership roles into the future, which is something that I'd love to see more of that. I think though it's incumbent upon CPOs to be more, particularly if you're working in not-for-profit. So if I think about more commercial enterprise, you need to be commercially minded.
Yes.
You need to be able to understand the drivers of the business. You need to be able to understand the business challenges that you're trying to solve and then help create and shape the plan around that. And that's where I think the best CPOs that I've worked with, and I've worked with some tremendous CPOs across, the West Farms Group and some of the former team that are in CPO roles today, which, I connect in with a lot. All of them understand business very well. Mm-hmm. And then they're able to translate that to sort of the people agenda. Yeah. I think that, the role of CPOs into the future is going to be more and more enterprise focused as well. And that's where I think we will see success come through. And I'm delighted by that. I don't necessarily think we have all the tools out there within a lot of the networks that we have to build commercial capability, but that would be something that I think is sort of really important. I'm just trying to go back to think the first part of your question as well. I'm very humbled. I'm very humbled by what you spoke about. There are certain things that we measure in our business, and I think a lot of businesses do. We measure things like engagement. We measure things like retention and absenteeism and those sorts of things. When we look at our engagement data, we ask questions around. So we have a perception of what our organizational culture is, what values that we believe to be true, but do they actually translate to say the shop floor, are they being lived day to day by the leaders in our organization? And our team will be very clear and give us feedback on that always. Now, I think in any high performance culture, there are elements that we would say, we want to continue on with, which is great, but we're always looking for the 10 to 15% that we need to get better at. So what are the behaviors we need to amplify more? What are the rewards we need to, perhaps, share more openly with our team? Because I think if you're very clear on your values, you're very clear on the rewards that are available for team and the behaviors, then you stand a better chance again, I think, of some success there as well. So I think there's probably some points in there, that how I think about it.
If you had one thing that, and I'm sure you do translate this, but if you thought about, you mentioned sport earlier, high
Yeah.
performance sport, the one thing that you think more organisations could pick up and learn from sport?
Mm. It's the gift of feedback.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that. I say it all the
Yeah.
time. I love
Yeah, it's
that.
the gift of feedback. And Melissa, I think it comes back down to a few things. Well, one of which is, you need to assume best intent when you are receiving the feedback and, when you're giving the feedback as well. I think if you can achieve that level of, right, the intention is good, now I'm open to receiving the feedback. The reason I'm really passionate about this, the best sporting teams do this in probably more robust ways, but they do it because it ultimately makes the team better. What I see, some teams do this very well, and they create space for feedback, for team feedback and individual feedback, and they are the beneficiaries in the long term because they're able to correct course very quickly. We all have, as human beings, what I think are blind spots or opportunities that we potentially prefer not to play in. But to receive feedback from your peers or your colleagues or the people you work around that is coming from a good place, I think helps you be a better person, better executive. So I think that would be the one skill if we can, if we're able to translate the feedback model, and there are lots of different tools available to do that, again, you stand a better chance of the success and achieving the goals that you're after.
Brilliant. And the final question I ask everyone, Damien, given the name of the podcast, what is brave feminine leadership from your perspective, and do you think it needs to change?
Uh, yeah, no, it's an interesting question. As a father of, three children, I've got two daughters and a son. I was thinking about the context of, brave feminine leadership. I would associate there are probably very traditional ways of thinking about some of the softer skills, and certainly even within the profession that I operate in, things like empathy and care and vulnerability and those sorts of things, which were probably more associated with more feminine characteristics. Um, I think today those characteristics are part of what I'd call the human-centered leadership.
Yeah.
And I would probably park the word feminine, and that just ultimately core leadership traits that we should expect of everyone.
Yeah.
If I think about human-centered leadership, having strong levels of EQ, but having leadership empathy and vulnerability. I mean, I just think they're traits that whether you're, male, female, non-binary, it doesn't matter. I mean, they're the sorts of humanistic traits that I think most organizations are looking for. And so I'd park the word, it's the feminine bit and just apply that more broadly across all parts of leadership.
Amazing. Thank you so much for joining the conversation, Damien. It's been fantastic having you join me.
Thanks, Melissa. It's been so great to have the conversation.